In the previous video, I gave you first introduction to test containers and demonstrated how you can use it to prepare a database for your integration test. For this, I've used Spring Boot version greater than 2.2.6 and JUnit 5, but there might be actual projects out there which don't use this recent version of these both dependencies. So with this video, I want to show you how you can achieve the same while using a Spring Boot version before 2.2.6 and still using JUnit 5. So what we want to try to do with this as our testing application architecture looks the following. We have our application here, and for our integration tests, we don't want to connect to our actual production database, but use test containers to prepare a Docker container for us. And all this should be done now with JUnit 4. And basically the test will be exactly the same what we did in the last video. We will ensure that we can start the context and inject our book repository and finally save a book. So let's start. So the first thing that is different with JUnit 4, first we still need the runner here. So let's add Spring Runner. Next, again, our Spring Boot test. So this is the same. And with JUnit 4, we have no extensions here. So what we can do, we can rely on a class rule. So this class rule will ensure to take care of starting and stopping our container. So again, create a container here. You can actually use the same setup here, so nothing changes if you use JUnit 4 on this side. The only difference for now is that we are using a class rule and not an extension. So extension is part of JUnit 5, and the class rules are from JUnit 4. So you can see here all this org.junit is JUnit 4. If you see something with Jupyter, that's JUnit 5. So that's the container. Now let's write a test. To make sure we actually use JUnit 4, I need the test annotation from JUnit 4. So not this one with a Jupyter, but the one above. So let's say here we write a test. Let's say context loads. That's fine. For the actual test, as we want to make it similar to what we already have, let's copy over this here. And also we need to auto-wire our repository. So that's everything for this. Now comes the interesting part, how we can populate our properties in a dynamic fashion, like the JDBC URL. With Spring Boot greater than 2.2.6, we had this nice solution here, which we don't have access to in versions before this Spring Boot version. What we can do otherwise is to create an application context initializer. For this, we can create a class inside our test here. Class, let's call it Initializer. And this class implements an interface from Spring, which is the application context initializer. And here we say we implement it with a configurable application context. That's fine. And now let's implement the method. So here we can say we have no access to this initialize. So in this initializer method here will take care of initializing our values. What we can do now, we can specify our test property. And there's a test properties values class we can use. Let's say values here. And there is a convenient way of populating them using this off method. So we can pass here an arbitrary number of strings, which are our configuration properties. So let's start with the first one, which is again our data source URL. In this sense, we have to concatenate the string here to make it work, and then we can ask our container to give us our JDBC URL. And that's the way how we specify the URL. Next comes, as we know from the previous video, the password. So also specify here password. And finally also the username. So now we have here a list. So actually 3 values. We also configured in the JUnit 5 test with a little bit more ceremony, I would say here, but still short enough. What we finally have to say, we have to take our values and apply them to our application context. And the application context we use here is the configurable application context we get passed to in this initialize method. So simply say apply this value to this context, and this will ensure to use them. The missing part is to tell our test or tell Spring we have an additional context initializer, therefore use the context configuration annotation and the initializers field. And here you can simply reference to our static class here. And this will take care of registering this initializer for the application startup and populating our values. So with this, let's try to run the test. As you see here, there's still the test containers output, so it seems like the managing of the container is working with JUnit 4 here also, so that's fine. And finally, we could also see here our success message. So our application is now actually working, and we could both inject our book repository and also save a book to our database, but using still JUnit 4 and the Spring Boot version before 2.2.6. As you see here, the difference is not that much. I mean, the first difference is the class rule instead of an extension. And the bigger difference is how we populate our dynamic properties here. Here we use a context initializer, and our other test, let's go back to it, uses this a little bit shorter way of populating properties. But still, I would say if there aren't that much properties, it's still a nice way to go. And you can see there's not much setup involved to write integration tests with a database.